Welcome to the True Crime Studio, where we explore powerful stories of love, redemption, and transformation. In today's video, we dive into the emotional journey of Alexander and Isabella, a couple torn apart by past mistakes, but brought together again by an incredible twist of fate. This is a story of second chances, forgiveness, and the strength it takes to rebuild a family. If you enjoy moving stories like this, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the True Crime Studio for more inspiring content. Let's begin this remarkable journey.
The Winter Gala at the Grand Hall in New York was the event of the season, a glittering display of power, wealth, and influence. The ballroom was filled with the hum of conversation, the clink of champagne glasses, and the soft rustle of luxurious gowns and tailored suits. Among the elite stood Alexander Blackwell, the business tycoon whose name was synonymous with success. Tall, confident, and impeccably dressed, he commanded attention without ever needing to speak. He had everything: money, influence, a successful empire. But tonight, his focus was on the beautiful actress at his side, Vanessa Ford, whose rising star had made her the most sought-after name in Hollywood. Vanessa laughed at something Alexander said, her voice musical, but his attention wavered. In the crowd of glittering faces, one stood out, familiar yet unexpected. It was Isabella Cross, Alexander's ex-wife. She had always been elegant, but tonight, she was dressed simply in the black and white uniform of a server, moving gracefully among the guests, delivering drinks and hors d'oeuvres with the precision of a professional. For a moment, Alexander couldn't breathe. His heart stuttered in his chest, and his gaze locked on her. She looked almost the same. Dark hair pulled back into a neat bun, her piercing blue eyes scanning the room, a small frown on her lips. But there was something different, something unmistakable about her that made him freeze. Isabella was pregnant. The swell of her belly was slight, but unmistakable. As their eyes met for the briefest of moments, the world seemed to slow down. She didn't smile, didn't offer any recognition. She just looked at him, quietly, briefly, before turning and disappearing into the staff area behind the curtains. Alexander stood there for a long moment, his mind racing. Vanessa, noticing his distraction, placed a hand on his arm, pulling his attention back to her. But Alexander couldn't shake the image of Isabella, or the 1,000 questions that bombarded him in that instant. Why was she here? Why was she working as a server? And most pressing of all, whose child was she carrying? The gala was still in full swing, but Alexander couldn't focus. His mind was consumed with Isabella. He excused himself from Vanessa and made his way out of the ballroom, feeling the weight of each step heavy on his chest. The staff corridor was quiet, the low hum of conversation echoing from the kitchen and storerooms as Alexander searched for her. He didn't know why he was so desperate to find her. But there was something about the sight of her, pregnant and working in the shadows, that felt wrong, incomplete, as though he was missing a crucial piece of the puzzle. When he found her, Isabella was unloading trays of empty glasses, her movements quick and efficient. She didn't seem to notice him at first, but the moment she turned, her eyes widened in shock and then narrowed in something resembling caution. Isabella. Alexander's voice was firm, but underneath it, there was a tremor of uncertainty. She said nothing, only watched him warily. He stepped closer, his gaze falling to her rounded belly. "Why are you here?" he asked, his voice softer now, filled with disbelief. "Why are you working as a server?" Isabella shifted uncomfortably, looking away for a moment, and then back at him. "I need to work," she said quietly, but there was something in her tone that made Alexander feel as if she were holding back. "What do you want, Alexander?" "Tell me whose child that is," he demanded, his voice tight. "Tell me it's not mine." Her eyes flashed, a flicker of defiance, but then the anger in her eyes was replaced with something else: sadness, regret. She sighed, a long, exhausted sound that filled the space between them. "It's yours," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I didn't want this to happen, but it did." The words hit Alexander like a punch to the stomach. His mind reeled as Isabella continued, her voice trembling. She told him about the struggles she'd faced since their divorce, how everything had fallen apart for her. After they separated, her life had spiraled. She had lost everything, including the support she had once had from him. The man who had promised her everything now felt like a distant memory, leaving her to fight alone. And when she found out she was pregnant, it felt like the final blow. Alexander's chest tightened. The anger that surged in him was tempered by a deep, gnawing guilt. His mind was racing. How could he have not known? How could he have been so blind to the consequences of his actions? "I'm going to make this right," he said, more to himself than to her. "I'll find out why this happened. Who did this to you? You won't have to fight alone anymore." Isabella looked at him with a mixture of disbelief and wariness. "You think you can fix this? You think you can just walk back into my life and fix everything? You don't understand, Alexander. It's not that simple." But Alexander didn't hear her. His mind was already on the next step, finding the truth. He was going to find out who had hurt Isabella and why she was left to suffer alone. And more importantly, he was going to make sure it never happened again. As he walked away, his resolve hardened. Isabella might not believe him, but he wasn't going to stop until he understood the full extent of her suffering and how it had all come to this moment. The days that followed were a blur for Alexander. His mind was consumed by the revelation about Isabella and the child. He couldn't shake the image of her, the woman he once loved, now carrying his child in secret. Everything about their divorce seemed like a distant memory, a time when their lives had been tangled in misunderstandings and pride. But this was different. This was a truth that cut deep, and it gnawed at him relentlessly. Back in the luxury of his penthouse office, the harsh fluorescent lights flickered overhead, but Alexander didn't notice. He stood by the window, gazing out over the vast cityscape, trying to process what had happened. He replayed the conversation with Isabella in his mind. The sadness in her eyes, the way she had spoken of her struggles, her isolation. She hadn't asked for any of this. And yet, here he was, living a life of opulence, while she had been left to fight on her own. He couldn't let that continue. Alexander had always been a man of action, of control. If there was one thing he was good at, it was fixing problems, and this was no exception. He couldn't just leave Isabella in the shadows, especially now that he knew the truth. He needed answers. He needed to understand why she was in this position, why she had been forced to live in anonymity, working in a job that was beneath her when she deserved so much more. He made a decision. The following morning, he hired a private investigator. He wasn't interested in subtlety. He didn't care about the privacy of those who had been involved. He needed to know everything. The investigator, a sharp and experienced man named Greg, had worked for Alexander on a number of cases before. He had a reputation for digging deep and uncovering things that were meant to stay hidden. Alexander trusted him implicitly. "This is personal," Alexander said, his voice low but filled with authority as he handed Greg a thick file. "I want to know everything. Who is behind this? Who made her life hell after our divorce?" Greg nodded, taking the file with a practiced motion. "Understood. I'll get to work immediately." Meanwhile, Isabella was doing what she had always done, surviving. Her apartment, small and modest, was filled with the hum of the refrigerator and the soft clicking of the old clock on the wall. She had no time for luxuries. The bills were piling up, the due dates growing nearer with every passing day. She hadn't expected to be in this position, struggling to make ends meet while carrying a child that she wasn't sure she could provide for. But as the days passed, she knew she had no choice but to keep going. The life she had once envisioned, the dreams she'd had of family and stability, seemed far away now. But there was one thing she couldn't deny. She was going to give her child the best life she could. No matter what. She sat at her small kitchen table, flipping through a pile of overdue bills, when a knock at her door startled her. She opened it cautiously, unsure of who would be visiting her. To her shock, it was Alexander. He stood there, tall and commanding, but there was something in his expression that made her pause. It was different. There was no arrogance, no distance, just a man who seemed almost vulnerable. "What do you want?" Isabella asked, her voice guarded, her brow furrowed in confusion. "I'm here to help," Alexander said, his voice steady but with an edge of uncertainty. "I know you don't believe me, but I want to make things right. You don't have to go through this alone. I'll help with the bills. I'll make sure you have everything you need for the baby." Isabella looked at him, her arms folded tightly across her chest. The idea of accepting help from him felt wrong, almost as if it would be admitting defeat. She had always prided herself on being independent, on not needing anyone. And yet, something about his words struck a chord deep inside her. The truth was, she was terrified. She didn't know how she was going to manage everything alone. "I don't know what you expect from me, Alexander," she said, her voice softening just a fraction. "I've been doing this on my own for a long time. I don't need you coming here and making promises." "I'm not making promises," Alexander replied firmly, taking a step closer. "I'm offering you help. You don't have to accept it, but I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." Isabella felt the weight of his words. She looked down at the floor, uncertain. But when she looked back up at him, she saw something in his eyes. A sincerity, a depth of feeling that she hadn't seen in years. Maybe it was the exhaustion of fighting so long, or the overwhelming weight of carrying a child on her own, but for the first time in a long time, Isabella felt like she could breathe. "I'll think about it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Alexander nodded, and without another word, he turned and left her apartment, leaving her standing in the doorway, her heart heavy with both relief and uncertainty. She didn't know what this meant, what it would lead to, but part of her couldn't help but feel that something was shifting between them. The next few days passed in a blur. Alexander threw himself into the investigation with a single-minded determination. Greg's updates came fast and furious, each piece of information more troubling than the last. As he dug deeper into Isabella's past, it became clear that there had been a concerted effort to tear her life apart. But who would want to do such a thing? Who would go so far as to destroy her career, ruin her reputation, and leave her destitute? The answer, when it came, hit Alexander like a freight train. Victor Caldwell. The name was one that Alexander knew all too well, a rival businessman known for his ruthless tactics and bitter hatred of anyone who threatened his empire. The two men had crossed paths several times over the years, but Alexander had always seen Caldwell as a petty competitor, someone who would never be able to stand up to him. But now, with the evidence in front of him, Alexander saw the truth. Victor had orchestrated a campaign to destroy Isabella. He had manipulated events behind the scenes, pulling strings in the media to paint her as unstable, untrustworthy. He had planted false stories about her, spread rumors that destroyed her credibility. And when she'd been vulnerable after their divorce, Victor had struck, targeting her in ways that Alexander hadn't even realized. Fury burned in Alexander's chest as he read through the details of Caldwell's plot. Isabella had been the victim of a systematic attack, and it had nearly destroyed her life. He wasn't going to let this stand. That evening, Alexander found himself at an exclusive industry gala. The rich and powerful filled the room, laughing and mingling as though the world outside had no bearing on their lives. But for Alexander, this was no ordinary event. It was his chance to confront the man who had done this to Isabella. He scanned the room, and there, across the way, he saw Victor Caldwell, smug, self-satisfied, and oblivious to the storm that was about to hit him. Alexander made his way toward him, his steps deliberate. He didn't wait for Caldwell to notice him. He didn't need to. He wasn't here to play games. "Victor," Alexander's voice cut through the murmur of conversation, and Victor looked up, surprised to see him. "We need to talk." The smile that had been plastered on Victor's face faded, and he stood straighter, sensing the tension in Alexander's voice. "What's this about, Blackwell?" he asked, his tone cool, but wary. "About Isabella Cross," Alexander said, his voice low and dangerous. "You've done enough damage to her life. Now, you're going to fix it." Victor's eyes narrowed, his smug demeanor faltering for a moment. "You think you can come in here and make demands? You don't understand how this business works, Blackwell." "No," Alexander said, his voice cold, his eyes hard as steel. "You don't understand. You've crossed a line, Victor, and I'm not going to let you get away with it." The room seemed to grow still as Alexander's words hung in the air, sharp and unwavering. Caldwell's face twisted into a sneer, but he knew in that moment that Alexander was not bluffing. "You'll regret this," Victor muttered under his breath, but it was too late. Alexander had already made up his mind. He wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not ever. The weeks following the confrontation with Victor Caldwell were a blur of activity. Alexander had pulled all the strings he could muster to ensure that Isabella was no longer alone in her struggles. He didn't just throw money at the problem. He took action. Real, tangible action. Isabella had been resistant at first, but Alexander wasn't giving up. Slowly, she began to accept his help, though a deep skepticism lingered in her heart. Isabella had moved into a safe, comfortable apartment in a better part of the city, an area far from the one she had struggled in before. It was a modest space, nothing extravagant, but it was secure, and that was all she needed for now. Alexander had seen to it that the bills she had been unable to pay were cleared, that her healthcare was taken care of, and that she would not have to worry about the financial strain of raising a child alone. But still, she felt a deep unease. Every time she saw him, every time he spoke to her with that earnestness in his eyes, she couldn't help but question his motives. She had been burned before, and it wasn't easy for her to trust him, not when their past had been filled with so many broken promises. Alexander was the man who had once made her feel like she was invincible, only to tear her world apart with his indifference. Could she really trust him now? Or was he just trying to make up for his guilt, to erase the mistakes of their past? One evening, after a long day of appointments and errands, Isabella was sitting at her kitchen table, nursing a cup of tea, when the doorbell rang. She opened it to find Alexander standing in the hallway, his expression softer than she had seen it in weeks. "I brought dinner," he said, holding out a large bag of takeout from one of her favorite restaurants. A quiet little place she used to visit on special occasions when things had been easier. "I thought we could eat together. You've been working hard." She hesitated, eyeing him with a mix of caution and curiosity. The gesture was simple, yet it felt strange. How had they come to this? Just a few weeks ago, she would have never imagined that they would sit down for a meal together, much less share a conversation. But things had changed. Whether she liked it or not, their lives were now intertwined, tied together by the child she was carrying and the shared history that neither of them could erase. "All right," she said finally, stepping aside to let him in, "but only because I'm starving." As they sat down at the small dining table, the tension between them was palpable. They ate in silence at first, each of them picking at their food as if it were a chore rather than a moment of connection. But then, as the minutes passed, the ice began to break. "How's the baby?" Alexander asked softly, his voice gentle. "Have you had any more appointments?" Isabella paused, setting down her fork and meeting his gaze. "Yes," she said, her voice flat. "Everything's going fine. The baby's healthy." Alexander nodded, but he could see the exhaustion in her eyes. The same exhaustion he had seen in her before when they had first met. She had always carried the weight of the world on her shoulders, even when they had been together. But now, there was something more, something fragile in her demeanor, as though she was teetering on the edge of something. What that something was, Alexander wasn't sure yet, but he intended to find out. "I know this isn't easy for you," he said, his voice low. "I'm not asking you to forgive me, but I'm here for you. I want to make things right for both of us, for the baby." Isabella stared at him for a moment, her eyes searching his face. She wanted to believe him. God, how she wanted to. But the wounds of the past ran too deep, and her heart was too afraid of opening itself up to him again. "I don't know if I can believe that," she said quietly, her voice tinged with sorrow. "You left me when I needed you the most. You didn't even try to understand what I was going through. You were too wrapped up in your world to see mine." "I know," Alexander admitted, his voice thick with remorse, "and I hate myself for it. I can't undo the past, Isabella. But I can be here now. I want to be here for you, for the baby. Please, let me try." There was silence again, a heavy, suffocating quiet that filled the space between them. For the first time, Isabella looked at him not with suspicion, but with something else, something that resembled hope. "All right," she said finally, her voice soft but resolute. "We'll try this, but I'm not going to make it easy on you. You have to prove yourself first." Alexander didn't hesitate. "I will, I promise." And with those words, a fragile partnership began to take root. Over the next several weeks, Alexander worked tirelessly to prove to Isabella that his intentions were genuine. It wasn't easy. She was a woman of strong convictions, and she didn't give her trust away lightly. But Alexander was determined. He didn't care how long it took or how many walls she put up. He was going to break them down. He started by immersing himself in her world. He made it a point to attend her doctor's appointments, sitting quietly by her side as they discussed the baby's health. He even accompanied her to a series of parenting classes, something she had always intended to do alone, but had never quite gotten around to. At first, Isabella had been uncomfortable with him tagging along. It was one thing to have him pay her bills, to offer financial support, but this felt too personal, too intimate. But Alexander was persistent. He kept showing up, and eventually, she started to soften. The parenting classes were awkward at first, filled with uncomfortable silences and forced smiles. But something began to shift between them. As they practiced diapering baby dolls and learned about the stages of child development, they found themselves laughing together. Real, genuine laughter. The kind that felt like the first crack in a wall that had stood for years. Alexander wasn't the perfect student. He fumbled with the baby doll, his fingers clumsy as he tried to tie a swaddle. But his sincerity was evident. He wanted to be a part of this new chapter in their lives. And for the first time, Isabella could see it. "Not bad for a billionaire," she teased one day, as Alexander finally managed to get the doll properly wrapped. He grinned, his eyes sparkling with amusement. "I'm full of surprises." But it wasn't just the classes that brought them closer. As they worked together to prepare for the arrival of the baby, Alexander found himself learning more about Isabella than he had in all the years they had spent together. He discovered her passions, her dreams, the things that had driven her before their divorce. And as he learned, he found himself admiring her in ways he hadn't before. Isabella, too, found herself seeing him in a new light. He wasn't the same man who had left her in the dust all those years ago. There was a vulnerability to him now, a quiet sincerity that made her wonder if he was capable of change after all. Slowly, she began to allow herself to hope, to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to make this work. Not just for their child, but for themselves as well. But they both knew that their journey was far from over. There were still deep scars from the past, wounds that couldn't be healed overnight. And trust, real trust, was something that couldn't be given freely. It had to be earned, one step at a time. And so they took those steps together, cautiously but determined, building a bridge between them that neither of them was sure could ever be strong enough. But in the quiet moments between them, in the shared laughter and the tender gestures, they both began to wonder if they were building something that could last. The night was heavy with tension, the air thick with unsaid words, when Isabella found herself struggling to assemble the crib. It had been one of those days where everything seemed to be slipping through her fingers. Her hands were tired, her mind weighed down with the endless tasks of preparing for the baby's arrival. The crib was one of the last pieces of the puzzle, a necessary but frustrating step. She had put it off as long as she could, but now it was time. She was just finishing screwing in the last leg when the doorbell rang. Startled, she paused, her hand hovering over the tool. She hadn't expected anyone. The only person who had been stopping by regularly was Alexander, and she wasn't sure she was ready to see him again. She had grown accustomed to being alone, to handling things on her own. But the fact that she couldn't seem to get this one simple thing right left her feeling exposed, vulnerable. Reluctantly, she walked to the door and opened it. There, standing in the hallway, was Alexander, his expression soft but determined. His gaze flicked to the living room, where the crib lay half-assembled, and then back to her. "You need help." His voice was quiet, almost hesitant, as though he was waiting for her permission. Isabella felt a knot tighten in her chest. She was exhausted, physically, emotionally, and the sight of him offering assistance without hesitation stirred something in her. She wanted to refuse him. She wanted to say that she could handle it herself, but the truth was she couldn't. Not tonight. "Yeah," she said, stepping aside to let him in. "I'm not exactly the world's best at this." Alexander smiled, the kind of smile that felt genuine, that made his whole face soften in a way she hadn't seen in years. "Don't worry, I'm pretty good with my hands." She couldn't help but laugh, a small, reluctant chuckle that made her realize how much she had missed the sound of him teasing her. Together, they worked in silence for a few moments, both of them focused on the task at hand. Isabella could feel the tension between them slowly start to dissipate as they moved in sync, assembling the crib piece by piece. There was something simple and comforting about the quiet collaboration, and for the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of peace. She wasn't doing this alone. He was here with her. She didn't have to pretend she had it all figured out. As they worked, Alexander spoke softly, breaking the silence. "I've been thinking about what you said, about how I wasn't there for you. And I'm sorry. I should have been there. I should have seen what you were going through. I shouldn't have left you to carry everything on your own." Isabella paused for a moment, feeling a wave of emotion crash over her. She had heard his apologies before, of course, but something about the way he said it now felt different. It wasn't just words. It was the sincerity in his voice, the way he was looking at her as though he truly understood. "I don't need you to keep apologizing," she said softly, her voice catching. "I need you to show me that you mean it. I need you to show me that I can trust you again." He nodded, his eyes locked on hers. "I will. I swear. I'm not asking you to forgive me right away. I just want you to know that I'm here for you. I'll be here for you, no matter what." The words hung between them, charged with the weight of everything they had been through, and everything that still lay ahead. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't a magical fix, but it was something more than they had had in a long time. And that, Isabella thought, might be enough for now. They finished assembling the crib together, and as Alexander stepped back to admire their work, he caught her gaze once more. There was a new tenderness in his eyes, a quiet understanding that had been missing before. Isabella felt a flicker of something. Hope, maybe? Or was it just a fleeting moment of weakness? Either way, it was enough to make her believe that perhaps this was the turning point they had been waiting for. The day Isabella had been dreading and anticipating arrived with the suddenness of a storm. It was a Sunday afternoon, the weather unusually warm for the time of year, when she felt the first wave of contractions. At first, they were mild, barely noticeable, but as the hours passed, the intensity grew. Panic began to rise in her chest, but she forced herself to stay calm. She had been through this once before, but it was different this time. There was a part of her that wasn't sure she could do this alone. She grabbed her phone and called Alexander, her hands shaking slightly as she dialed the number. He answered on the first ring. "I think it's happening," she said, her voice trembling. "Where are you? I'm coming now," Alexander replied immediately, his voice sharp with urgency. "I'm at home," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. Just get here fast." The moment she hung up, the contractions hit again, stronger this time, and Isabella had to brace herself against the kitchen counter, the pain forcing her to bend forward. It was happening. Her baby was coming, and she wasn't ready. She had always imagined doing this alone. The thought of relying on anyone, least of all Alexander, had been a distant fantasy. But now, as the pain grew more intense, she realized she couldn't do it on her own. She needed him. By the time Alexander arrived, Isabella was barely able to stand. His eyes widened with alarm when he saw her in pain, and without a word, he stepped forward, wrapping his arms around her and helping her into the car. They drove to the hospital in silence, the air between them filled with unspoken words. Isabella clutched his hand tightly, her grip almost painful, but Alexander didn't flinch. He was there for her. That was all that mattered. At the hospital, the hours dragged on in a blur of doctors, nurses, and agonizing pain. But through it all, Alexander never left her side. He was there, holding her hand, whispering words of encouragement, doing everything he could to ease her discomfort. For the first time, Isabella saw him not as the man who had failed her, but as a man who was trying to do the right thing. When the moment finally arrived, when she felt the overwhelming urge to push, Alexander was right there, right next to her. His face pale with anxiety, but determined to stay with her every step of the way. And then, after what felt like an eternity, the cry of their son pierced the air. The loudest, most beautiful sound Isabella had ever heard. She collapsed back against the bed, tears streaming down her face as she held her son for the first time. James. Alexander stood at her side, looking down at their son with a mixture of awe and disbelief. It was as if all the years of pain, all the heartbreak, had led to this moment, the moment that defined everything. Their child, their son, was here. In that moment, something shifted between them. The years of resentment and anger began to fade, replaced by a shared sense of responsibility, of love. Isabella looked up at Alexander, her eyes soft but filled with emotion. "He's ours," she whispered, her voice breaking with the weight of everything they had been through. Alexander nodded, his eyes misty as he gazed at their son. "He is, and I'm not going anywhere this time, I promise." And as they stood there together, holding their son in their arms, they knew that this was just the beginning of a new chapter, one where forgiveness, love, and redemption would be built, piece by piece, with each passing day. The weeks following James's birth passed in a blur of diapers, sleepless nights, and the overwhelming joy of new parenthood. Isabella had expected the transition to be difficult, but nothing could have prepared her for the profound emotional impact that caring for her child had on her. She was no longer just a mother in name. She was a mother in every sense of the word. Every cry from James tugged at her heartstrings, and every smile was like a tiny miracle. At first, she had done most of the care herself. She had always been independent, and she found comfort in knowing that, despite everything, she could still rely on herself. But Alexander's presence in her life had shifted something in her. Slowly, she began to allow him to take on more responsibility, to share in the care of their son. And to her surprise, Alexander didn't hesitate. In the middle of the night, when James woke for his feeding, Alexander would stumble sleepily into the nursery, his hair disheveled and his eyes heavy with exhaustion, but he never complained. He learned to change diapers, to feed the baby, to rock him to sleep, all with a tenderness that Isabella had never thought possible from the man who had once seemed so detached. There was one night, in particular, when Isabella was sitting on the edge of the bed, nursing James, when Alexander came in with a bottle, ready to help. He smiled softly as he sat beside her. "I thought I'd take a shift tonight," he said quietly, as though he were asking for permission. Isabella looked at him for a long moment. It wasn't just the exhaustion she was feeling. It was something deeper, something that made her wary of letting him in again. But as she watched him hold their son, as she saw the love and the care in his eyes, she felt her defenses start to slip. "Thank you," she whispered. "I'm not used to relying on anyone." Alexander's smile softened as he took James into his arms, gently rocking him. "I know, but maybe it's time you let me help. You've done this on your own for so long." She nodded, feeling a warmth spread through her chest at the sight of him with their son. In that moment, she realized that this was the man he could be, the man she had always hoped he would be, the man she could trust. It wasn't perfect. There were still things they needed to work through. But with every small act of kindness, he was proving that he could be a father, that he could be the partner she had once needed. As James grew, so too did the bond between Isabella and Alexander. The tentative steps they had taken toward rebuilding their relationship had begun to solidify into something real, something worth holding on to. It wasn't easy. They still had their arguments, still struggled with old wounds that hadn't fully healed, but each day brought them closer to a shared understanding, a shared future. Isabella had started taking steps to rebuild her own life, too. After years of putting her dreams on hold, she finally took the leap and enrolled in a program to pursue her passion for social work. She had always felt a calling to help others, especially single mothers who struggled like she once had. But until now, the time and energy hadn't been there. Now, with Alexander's newfound commitment and their growing family, she felt ready to make the changes she had been waiting for. She spent her days balancing the demands of motherhood and school, and her nights, when James finally fell asleep, were spent in study or work on her assignments. Alexander was there for her every step of the way, not just as a father, but as a partner in her dreams. He watched their son so she could attend classes, made dinner when she was too tired, and supported her as she began to build a career that was her own. One afternoon, after a particularly draining week, Isabella came home to find Alexander in the kitchen, preparing a dinner for the three of them. The smell of garlic and fresh herbs filled the air, and there was James, perched in his high chair, laughing at something Alexander was doing. For the first time in a long while, Isabella felt the weight of the past slip away. She had spent so many years carrying the burden of their relationship on her shoulders, but now, as she watched Alexander and James together, she saw the man he had become. He wasn't perfect, but he was here, trying, really trying. "Smells good," Isabella said, leaning against the doorway and watching him. He turned, giving her that soft smile she had come to cherish. I figured I'd give you a break tonight. She smiled back, feeling a genuine warmth toward him. I appreciate it. After dinner, they sat together as a family, talking about their day. It was simple, but it was everything. They weren't just co-parents anymore. They were becoming a family, rebuilding the connection that had been broken for so long. That night, as Isabella lay in bed, she realized just how far they had come. There were still challenges ahead. There always would be. But for the first time in years, she felt hopeful. They were moving forward, together. And in that forward movement, there was strength. There was love. There was redemption. As the months passed, a new rhythm settled into Isabella and Alexander's life. Parenthood had transformed them, reshaping their relationship in ways they hadn't anticipated. James had grown into a happy, curious toddler, his laughter filling their home like the sound of a song that made everything else fade away. And with him, so did the healing process between Isabella and Alexander. They had learned to navigate the challenges of being parents together, and through it all, they had begun to build something far more profound than either had ever imagined, a true partnership. The tension that had once defined their interactions had softened, replaced by a shared commitment to their son and, in time, to each other. Their daily routine had become a dance of mutual respect. Isabella continued to attend her classes and volunteer work, striving to make a difference in the world. She was becoming a woman she was proud of, and Alexander was a constant source of support. He worked tirelessly at his business, but he made time for her. Time for their family. There were still struggles, days when the weight of their past loomed too large, when old habits resurfaced and threatened to disrupt their fragile peace. But they worked through it, step by step, learning how to communicate without the defensive walls they had once built so high. One afternoon, Isabella came home to find Alexander sitting in their living room, a rare moment of stillness in his usually hectic schedule. James was napping, and the quiet gave the room a peaceful air. Alexander looked up from the stack of papers in front of him, his eyes meeting hers with a softness she hadn't seen before. I've been thinking, he said, his voice low and contemplative, about everything, about how we've gotten here. Isabella, still standing in the doorway, tilted her head. She had learned to appreciate these quiet moments of introspection between them, the times when they could speak openly, without the weight of tension or expectations. What about it? She asked gently. About the way we started, he said, pushing the papers aside. The way I treated you. And I keep thinking how lucky I am, how lucky we are to have this, to have James, to have each other. Isabella felt her heart swell, her chest tightening with emotion. She had never imagined that she and Alexander could reach this point, but here they were, parents, partners, people who had weathered storms together. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. I'm proud of you, she said, her voice soft but sincere, of everything you've done, of the way you've changed, the way you've been there for James and me. You're not the man you were when we first met, Alexander, and neither am I. He stood up, walking toward her with an intensity that made her heart race. We've both grown, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I know I've hurt you, and I know I can never undo that. But I want to be the man you need, the man James deserves. Isabella's breath caught in her throat. She had never doubted his commitment. He had shown it every day in countless little ways. But hearing him say it aloud, hearing the sincerity in his voice, made her realize how far they had come. I believe you, she whispered. In that moment, there were no more questions. There was no more uncertainty about what lay ahead. They were not the same people who had walked through the doors of their past. They were different now, stronger, built on a foundation of love, trust, and the promise of a future they would create together. The first birthday party for James was a small but meaningful event, hosted in the cozy apartment where Isabella and Alexander had slowly, carefully rebuilt their life together. It wasn't a grand affair. There were no extravagant decorations or expensive gifts. It was simple, a gathering of close friends and family, people who had been a part of their journey, people who had seen them grow and change. Isabella stood by the window, looking out at the city below. The sun was just starting to set, casting a warm glow across the skyline. She felt a quiet sense of peace settle over her as she watched Alexander play with James in the living room. It was a moment she never thought she would experience. Not just the joy of motherhood, but the warmth of being with someone who truly understood her. Someone who was no longer the man who had hurt her, but the man who was fighting every day to prove he could be better. As she watched them, a gentle smile spread across her face. She didn't need anything more. They had everything they needed right here. Isabella, Alexander's voice broke her thoughts. He had come up behind her, his hand on her shoulder. It's time. She turned to him, her heart swelling with pride and love. Is it really? She asked, her voice thick with emotion. He nodded, his expression tender. Yes, it's time for us to celebrate. The party had started. Friends and family gathered around, smiling and chatting, their faces full of joy as they watched James, crawling across the floor in his tiny, adorable outfit, trying to take his first steps. Isabella's mother was there, of course, beaming with pride at her grandson. There were moments when Isabella could hardly believe how much her life had changed. The little girl who had dreamed of a family had become the woman standing here now, watching her child take his first steps toward his future with Alexander by her side. Later, as the party wound down and the guests began to leave, Isabella and Alexander found themselves alone in the quiet apartment. They stood together by the window, watching the city lights flicker on, a peaceful silence between them. I never imagined this day would come, Isabella said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Neither did I, Alexander admitted, his gaze softening as he looked at her. But here we are, and we've made it. For a moment, they simply stood there, taking in the enormity of what they had accomplished. They had come so far, through the heartache, the struggles, and the pain. And now, they were standing on the other side, stronger, more united. James is our second chance, Isabella murmured, her voice full of wonder. He's what we've been waiting for. He's the reason we're here. Alexander nodded, his arm slipping around her shoulders as they both watched their son sleep peacefully in his crib. He is, and so are we. As they stood there, their arms around each other, they knew this was only the beginning. The road ahead would still have its challenges, but they were ready. They were a family now, together, strong and united in a love that was tested but unbreakable. And as they looked at their son, who was the light of their lives, they knew that their second chance had arrived. It was just the beginning. The story of Isabella and Alexander is not just a journey of love and forgiveness, but a tale of growth, of finding oneself in the most challenging moments. They were once strangers, people who loved each other, but were torn apart by the wounds of their past. Yet through each challenge, through decisions made and relentless effort, they found each other again. They were no longer just parents to James. They were transformed individuals, no longer burdened by past mistakes, but people who knew how to love and share. James, their little boy, was the living proof of the miraculous changes life can bring. He was the result of their tireless efforts, of a love that endured despite every obstacle. In James's eyes, Isabella and Alexander saw everything they had lost and everything they had reclaimed. He was the reason they would keep moving forward, together, building a future free from the shadows of their past. The story ends not with empty promises, but with a deep understanding of love, family, and forgiveness. It is a journey that never truly ends, a road they would walk together, no matter how difficult, always filled with hope and belief. Isabella and Alexander had found a solid foundation, a true home, not through perfection, but through what they had overcome and how they accepted each other. They had truly been given a second chance, and this time, they wouldn't let it slip away. Alongside James, they would continue to write their story, a story not just about love, but about life, growth, and the pursuit of true happiness. And in that moment, they knew that no matter what came next, they had found the most important thing in life, each other.
Thank you for joining us for this heartwarming and emotional story here on the True Crime Studio. Alexander and Isabella's journey reminds us that love, forgiveness, and resilience can overcome even the deepest wounds. Their story teaches us the value of second chances and the courage it takes to confront the past and rebuild for the future. It's a powerful reminder that family and connection are worth fighting for. If this story inspired you, please give it a thumbs up, Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to the True Crime Studio for more incredible stories of redemption and love. See you in the next video.